we're all people. This is all stuff that affects humans. And so neurodivergents are people. Surprise, surprise to RFK Jr. and other folks out there. Autistics and ADHDers and all other neurodivergents, we're also just humans. We're variants of humanity. So yeah, we end up with similar health issues as humans have. Hello and welcome to the Trauma Informed SLP. I am Kim Neely. I am neurodivergent and queer and a licensed speech language pathologist in the United States. We are also called speech therapists in other countries, or speech language therapists. And on this channel, I use my hyperfixation with human psychology and trauma-informed care to examine human connection and communication through a trauma-informed lens to promote more understanding, compassion, and healing from all the bleh that's out there in society, all the time, especially right now. Yikes. So for today, I am going to finish up kind of the self side of the Venn diagram for the welcome to your late diagnosis neurodivergence. I know unmasking, I said, would be the crossover to more the societal adversity, but this one is more like the smorgasbord of neurodivergencies that are possible. So it's like 11 plus, maybe 12-ish, possibly things to know about neurodivergency. Because neurodivergency is a veritable smorgasbord. Orgasborg. That is a reference to Charlotte's Web.
Affair is a veritable smorgasbord, orgasbord, after the crowds have ceased.
And I think this is really important if you're a parent of an autistic child or ADHD child or any other neurodivergency, like any syndrome or anything. And I think it's also useful if you are a late diagnosed person who's possibly discovering what differences your brain has in terms of how it functions. And also useful to know about in neurodivergent spaces if you start to hang out with more diagnosed neurodivergence. Most of us late diagnosed adults have come to realize that a lot of our natural friends, the people we tend to gravitate toward, usually are not particularly that neurotypical any hoots, really. This is also basically other support need considerations for if you're planning a party or something. These are things that might affect that. There are also things that can affect sensory profiles. Some of the stuff can definitely affect that. It can affect interpersonal relationships with how we experience and communicate how we're feeling about things, right? That's what we're going to be talking about. So, and things that affect our memory, our ability to remember certain things. That's what we're going to be talking about because, yeah, a lot of neurodivergents have these other things. Now, any one of these 11 things in and of itself is essentially a neurodivergency, to be honest, for the most part. But they do co-occur with autism and ADHD and sometimes other syndromes like Down syndrome and such more than they do in the general population. So that's why it's good to know about in the neurodivergent world. I have sectioned this out. We're going to initially talk about the IAs. These are words that end in IA. Essentially, they are medical sounding words, fancy terms that end in an IA. So we'll talk about those. Then we're going to talk about dominant survival mode things. So these are things where you have your fight, flight, freeze system on alert, and there are certain ways that our body's physiology might just do something a little different than what we would expect of someone in a survival mode. So we're going to talk about that, or at least maybe not different, but more bigger. They might have a bigger survival mode reaction than you would expect, And then we're going to talk about a couple other little just bonus things that are good things to know about, which might end up being their own videos in the future if you wish for it. Let me know in a comment below if you want me to talk in more detail about any of these. I would be happy to research it and do a video for you. So let's go ahead and get started with the IAs. These are things like Alexithymia, Synesthesia, Aphantasia, Prosopagnosia, Anosognosia, and Dyslexia, and hyperlexia, dyscalculia, dysgraphia. See how it all ends in ia? These are the terms under the EAs. So let's start with the very first one on my list, which is alexithymia. I think this one is the really big one for a lot of autistics and late diagnosed like ADHDers and autistics to understand about ourselves. And also, this one is a really big one for people who have any type of trauma history. So if you either have diagnosed PTSD or complex PTSD or like essentially developmental trauma, that's usually what the DSM-5 says. CPTSD is not in the DSM-5. It's in the International Classification of Disorders. But if you have any of those sort of things, alexithymia might be something you experience, which alexithymia is essentially the inability to recognize or label your emotions and or the emotions of other people. So it can involve both sides, okay? But alexithymia at its core is thought to come from the physiological changes for trauma anyway. It comes from more physiological changes for neurodivergence. It could be related to adversity and like possibly trauma responses from that. It could also relate to just possibly how people's brains are wired. Really hard to distinguish those two because a lot of neurodivergents experience some level of bullying or teasing or some kind of mistreatment pretty early on in life. So kind of hard to distinguish which came first, chicken or egg. But essentially, when I think I've talked about this in some of my other videos, but I definitely have a podcast episode on fight, flight, freeze response stuff that goes into how our brain processes emotion, essentially. So in our midbrain system, that's where we have like the awareness of something going on, but we are subconsciously processing what's going on, what is stressing us out, like how are we feeling about something, right? We don't actually become consciously aware until that information comes up to this area of our brain, the prefrontal area, the frontal cortex. That's where we become aware of emotions, okay? So we don't have awareness until it gets there. And it mainly has to come from like the amygdala, particularly in the midbrain, that little guy whose job is actually just to appraise incoming information, and it does a lot of other things, but it definitely appraises if something is good or bad, or we like it or we don't like it. It's going to make that sort of appraisal. And then it'll send that information up to the anterior cingulate cortex, which is kind of like here-ish, okay? It's kind of like in there, like a little bit deeper than I can point to from the outside. And that is where we become consciously aware that we're having some kind of a feeling. And that area of our brain also connects to the language centers, our language processing, particularly for expressive language, like Broca's area. That's a really big area for putting together what we want to say in terms of expressive language, whether you're using spoken language or written or like sign language. Broca's areas is still usually involved with that. What tends to happen with folks in trauma anyway, and like trauma responses, and kind of one of the hallmarks of trauma really, is that when someone's in a survival mode or in like a really high stress situation, essentially, when you have a really high, sympathetic system activation going on in your body, what tends to happen is the amygdala down regulates its connection to your anterior cingulate. So the midbrain and this part of the brain, they're still turned on. They're just not talking to each other. Okay. Kind of like having, like, if you have your computer and your spouse or your roommate or somebody has their computer, and then like maybe you could be playing a game together over Wi-Fi, but then the Wi-Fi goes down, And so now your computers are still on, you just can't play the game because like the Wi-Fi is disconnected. So those computers aren't talking to each other like they were before through the internet. Does that make sense? So that's kind of what down regulation is like. And what that means is the information the anterior cingulate needs in order to label emotion isn't really getting to it. Okay. It's not getting enough input to actually be able to like say, ooh, I think I recognize what we're feeling, and then to send it over to our language centers and for us to be able to talk about it, okay? And there's also an area called the insula that's more temporal and kind of tucked in there that has a lot to do with how we recognize other people's emotions, and it connects a lot to anterior cingulate, and so it suffers from a similar issue if the downregulation is occurring. Or if perhaps these connections just aren't that robust, possibly if it is something that's more innate in how a brain is wired from birth, which it could be, but we don't really have data on that. That's going to be a very, very difficult thing to parse out for humans in terms of ethical research. That would be incredibly hard to parse out. But that is something to consider. So a lot of autistics talk about having alexithymia. It's very common to talk about in the autistic community. It's common, like I said, with trauma victims. And I think just important to know, because people with really severe alexithymia genuinely might not be able to remember having certain emotions. And I think it actually might impact memory to some extent, because conscious memory often gets tied to emotional memory. Like if you're at a party and you're having a really great time, and maybe you still have sympathetic activation because of that really great time, you're just having super fun, lots of adrenaline and stuff. It's just super fun, super great time. Somebody with more severe alexithymia, the emotion of that moment, it might not be something they remember, because it might not be something they consciously recognized at the time. You know what I mean? Even if their body is still feeling it, their conscious brain might not know. I think that is one of the things that does impact how people express empathy toward others, how if we are recognizing an emotion in others, we don't instantly label that emotion. We don't instantly say like, yeah, that sounds really, that makes sense that you sound really frustrated, and it makes total sense you sound frustrated. That might be hard for neurodivergent brains to do. So then they start doing that thing, which I have definitely done many times, and I'm trying to learn not to do it as much, where you start to kind of talk about times you have felt a similar emotion as a way of trying to show that you understand what they're saying, like you empathize with their emotion. We like think of a situation where that occurred to us, and we don't think to label the emotion, because I think sometimes if you have any level of alexithymia, it can be tricky to like label the emotion. It can be like, I don't know what emotion that was, but I recognize when I felt something similar, but I don't know what to call it. And so it makes like the communication of empathy very different, which we'll get into when we talk about double empathy problem. That's a huge piece of that. Don't you worry, we'll get there. I think it's just something to know about, because I do think it leads to a lot of communication differences and also memory differences, and interpersonal relationship stuff could get really messy. If one person has more severe alexithymia than the other, it can get hard talking about like, how do you actually feel about me? And then like the other person is like, I don't even know. And it's like, it makes it sound like they're really cold and callous, but it could just be that they like don't know. They don't know the actual feeling. They can't label the feeling. They might just be able to say like, I like being around you. Like they might know that, you know, and they might like talking to you, and they know they like you, but they can't expound upon that, you know? So it's just something to know about, something to kind of parse through, I think, a bit. Let's move on to other EAs, though, so I don't go too deep into alexithymia, because I could probably talk about that for a lot longer. The next thing I want to talk about on the EAs is synesthesia. Synesthesia is when people are experiencing more than one sensation from a single sensory input. So these are people who, if they hear a certain sound, they might taste something in their mouth from that sound, like actually physically taste it, or they might see colors when they hear sounds, right? Or vice versa. They might see colors and hear sounds instead of, you know, or, you know, but it could be any of those senses where whether it is like touch, you might have a physical sensation of touch for a certain thing, a sensation of taste, sight, sound. It's some sort of, it's thought to be anyway, some type of cross-wiring essentially in our sensory processing in our brain. Some people just have that. This isn't necessarily like you hear the buzzing in lights, because that buzzing is real. You are hearing it. That's a heightened sensation of hearing. But if it's like you hear the buzzing of lights and you're starting to see a color, like the room suddenly looks yellow or something when it didn't before, it looks purple, okay? Or you hear the buzzing and you taste bitterness in your mouth or something, right? That would be synesthesia. It's really rare in the general population, and it's still pretty rare even in autistics. I think the thought is general population is like 1 to 3%, and autistics are probably like 5 to 10%, but I don't know how accurate that data really is, because there's not a whole lot of studies out there on this. It's kind of more of that interesting thing to study. It's not often studied because it's like an essential thing to study. So I don't know how accurate that is, but it is something to know about. I think it's important to consider if you're like a parent especially, or if you live in a mixed neurodivergent household and you have lots of high sensory needs and maybe contrasting sensory needs. I always think about this as a speech language pathologist. I don't have synesthesia, not directly. I'm kind of curious if I have a little mere touch synesthesia, because I do tend to feel a lot of pain when there's a lot of stuff I can't watch on the news because I will feel physically sick or pain or something, which mere touch synesthesia is a condition where you mirror the sensation you're seeing someone experience, so you could actually feel the actual physical emotional feeling or the actual physical touch when you see it happen. It is more rare. I don't think I full on have it, but I can get close to it with certain people and with certain situations. But back to synesthesia, just in general, as an umbrella term, I always think about this even as a provider because, like, for example, like with little kids, especially kids who are really hypersensitive to a lot of things and get really dysregulated from their hypersensitivities. I actually had a client once that I worked with who was non-speaking, and we were working on getting like some kind of communication device to help this kid communicate more. But one thing that I noticed with this kid is every time a certain like vibrant yellow things always went in his mouth all the time. Whether it was a toy, whether it was like a marker, it didn't matter. If it was yellow, he wanted it in his mouth. And the same item in other colors, no. Didn't put it in his mouth. It was just yellow, which became a whole thing that I had to teach about. We had those like yellow Lysol wipe like containers, and he kept wanting to put that in his mouth. So I eventually just had to lock it away, but I had to do a whole lesson around like that can make you like really sick. Like you can have a really big owie, because he was little. I would say like a really big owie if you like don't put that in your mouth, like cleaning things. No. But I always wondered, this kid didn't have the capability to explain to me his internal experience of the color yellow, but I always wondered maybe he had a taste associated with yellow. Maybe that's why those things were going in his mouth, because maybe when he saw the color yellow, maybe there was a taste that was like a really pleasant taste. And so in his like young little kid brain, it was like, if I put these things in my mouth, they're like food basically, because they taste, the yellow, the color itself tastes like something. So it's like the association was like, eat it, bite it, it's food, I don't know. It was always a curiosity to me. So it was just something I always consider. If there's a kid who seems to be really hypersensitive, if they can't tell me their internal experience, and so I don't know if they might have synesthesia, it's still something I keep in the back of my mind, like maybe, let me think about if they have a little cross-wiring with a certain sensation. And then also, as a speech pathologist, is something I would consider, especially for the non-speaking kids or for the just really little kids who don't really know how to explain, because if this is the way you're wired, you just assume everybody experiences like that, right? Like if you have a taste when you see color yellow, why would you ever think no one else tastes yellow? Right? As a little kid, you would just think, of course, everybody, a yellow has a taste, duh, is probably the way they would think about it. But I always considered like kind of teaching like that actually is different. And that's a unique thing, and that like not everybody has that experience, teaching that to them and teaching them to be able to explain it a little more. So that's just something to consider with synesthesia, because maybe they're having extra sensations that you don't even know they're having. And it's probably good to know about if you happen to have a really hypersensitive kid, or if you yourself are really hypersensitive to certain things. Maybe you have it, maybe you don't. I don't know. There's like a synesthesia test online for you to test yourself and see. If I did the test, I don't have actual synesthesia, no. But I have really good visualization in my mind. I can make really clear images in my mind when I think about things. Which brings me to the next idea, which is aphantasia. You might have heard about this. Aphantasia is mind blindness, is one way people say it, but essentially these are people who can't drum up a picture in their mind. If you tell them to think of like an apple, they can remember what an apple looks like, so they could probably describe an apple they've seen, but they can't visualize the apple, right? So anything about visualization is different. And there's like a range of how much people can visualize. If I take the time to focus on an apple, I can visualize it deep enough to almost be experiencing eating it, really, because I have a really strong ability to visualize in my head. But there are plenty of neurodivergents out there who struggle with that. And there is an autistic on YouTube who has aphantasia, who has done a lot of videos on that. And I will link that somewhere up here, her channel, just so you know. I think the channel name changed, because it used to be like I Am Mind Blind, I think used to be the channel name, but I think she changed it recently, and I don't remember what it is right now. If I remember, and while I'm editing, I'll put it up on the screen. Read the screen if you're just listening for what that is. But she would talk about how much this affects her ability to remember certain things, because being able to visualize things can really be an important part of how we remember certain events or things that need to be done, or like you're going to the grocery store, if you can visualize the food you need to pick up, that helps you remember your list. And she struggles with memory for that reason, because she really can't drum up images in her head. So like if she reads a book, she's not picturing what's going on in the book while she reads it. She can't. She can't get immersed in reading that way, And so that's just something to know about, because not everybody has strong visualization in their head, and some people have extremely strong visualization. And so it's like myself. And so sometimes it's a little like it's weird for me to conceptualize that someone doesn't have that because I have it so strongly. But it's something, now that I know about it, I can like bridge any sort of miscommunication that might come from that. Or like if I know someone has aphantasia and I'm using visual like language to remember something, like I might want to, check in with them and see like I'm probably not making any sense and I'm sorry, like, don't worry about it, kind of a thing. The next IA is Prosopagnosia. I realized while editing I said that wrong. Prosopagnosia. I'm like putting a P where the S is. This is similar to aphantasia, but prosopagnosia is face blindness. So there is a part of our brain, which is sort of an upstream part of our visual system, where our brain associates features with faces, essentially. We have a facial recognition system in our brain, if you will, okay? And in some people, that facial recognition system just doesn't work very well. So it's really hard for them to recognize people by their faces. In my graduate school for speech language pathology, there was actually a professor there who had face blindness. And we didn't know that until he came and gave a guest lecture to us as a cohort and like let us know that he has that. And it's like, oh, it makes so much sense, because if you waved at him down the hall, he kind of did this number at you. Like I'm not sure who that is, because if he couldn't hear your voice, he wasn't sure who you were. So people always found that kind of odd, that he always had that weird look at when people were waving. And it's because he was like, it's because I can't tell who they are until like I'm using like their height, the way they walk, and if they say something, I might be able to recognize them. But initially just looking at them, if they're just waving, I won't know who that is, because of the face blindness, unless they have a defining feature. Like for me, my glasses I didn't have these at the time, but I know someone else who has prosopagnosia who actually I only met online for the longest time. And then when I finally met him in person again, he recognized me from my glasses. Like that was an immediate recognition. So, and this is also something I started to consider with clients as well, because I remember a while back, there was this one little autistic boy I was working with who was speaking, and he was like a super sharp little kid. But I usually wear my hair up when I'm working with kids, because you don't want them to grab them and pull them, and I also don't want my hair to be in the way, so I usually put it up. And there was a day where he came in and my hair was actually down, and he wanted my hair up. Like it was bugging him that my hair was down. And so he came up and like tried to pull my hair back and just started studying my face. And at that moment, I started thinking, I wonder if this kid has some face blindness. And I wonder if like my hair being down made him not really recognize me. Like I sound like me, but he can't really, like, this is not Miss Kim. This is somebody else. I think he possibly was thinking in his head. And so that is one thing to consider too. If you happen to have kids who are really resistant to physical changes, like haircuts, if people go for a haircut, or if like somebody dyes their hair in the family a new color, or they change their glasses. If you know someone who's really reactive to that kind of thing, or it really bugs them, consider maybe they have some level of face blindness. And so the thing that they're frustrated by is that the visual cue they use to recognize that person is now gone or has changed, because that is a lot of what people with prosopagnosia use in order to recognize people. The next one I want to mention is Anosognosia. Anosognosia is being unaware of health conditions or problems that you have. So this is really common in certain mental illnesses, like schizophrenics tend to be not so aware. Bipolar disorder can possibly not be very aware, at least in certain stages of their bipolarism. They might not be aware of their disorder at that point. It is also very common in traumatic brain injuries. There's a certain stage of recovery in traumatic brain injury where we don't expect them to really realize what their actual weaknesses are and what they're struggling with. It becomes this whole thing. Typically at those stages, they're usually still in a hospital, like inpatient setting, because they're not very safe to go out and try to function for themselves or for others because they're unaware of what they can't do. So if they went behind like the wheel of a car, it would be a really dangerous thing for them and other people. So they're usually in the hospital, and usually with their anosognosia, they start to kind of blame the hospital for why they can't do things because their brain just isn't healed enough to be cognitively aware, to have that sort of metacognition of like, oh yeah, I do struggle with that now. Yeah. Like, I do struggle with my memory after the brain injury, right? Like, you won't hear them say that. It'll be more like, well, I would remember things if I weren't here in the hospital. It's here. That's why I can't remember things. And it's like, that's a very common thing, and it's part of anosognosia. It is a symptom of their recovery and a symptom of the brain injury. So just so you know, if you ever have anyone who has stroke or some other kind of brain injury, they might have some anosognosia, and that's a thing. And it can definitely happen also with like, if people have more severe or more cognitive comorbidities with autism or even ADHD or something, they might have a bit of anosognosia of like not always being aware of what they don't know. It's like they don't know what they don't know, right? They can't quite, they're not aware that they struggle with certain things. All right. Now, other EAs, I'm not going to go as deep into, but these are things like dyslexia/hyperlexia. I'll probably talk about hyperlexia because I feel like people have probably heard of dyslexia, even though that does not always get represented as well as it probably should. But dyslexia is essentially an issue with sound-letter correspondence stuff, right? It's the side of reading we call decoding in sound-based alphabet systems. That tends to be why the letters might look like they move around or something, but it's because like their brain's just not connecting that letter to a sound, and they're not able to like decode, like sound out the word. That's very, very difficult, if not nigh on impossible for dyslexic. Hyperlexia is something you do see, especially in autistic kids and little, like 3-year-old or so hyperlexic autistics. These are the kids whose parents will be like, they are reading advanced texts, right? They're reading War and Peace at 3. They're reading it out loud to their parents at night or something. And what typically that is essentially, it's literally the opposite of dyslexia in the sense that their brain picked up on the patterns of how we combine certain letters to make certain sounds to then, to form the word. They've picked up on that pattern so well and are at such an advanced degree that even as a little kid, they're able to fluently read off the words. They might not fully comprehend what's going on in something like War and Peace. They'll learn the comprehension later. You don't expect a 3-year-old to understand things like War and Peace, okay? Like, we don't expect them to understand advanced novels and literature and stuff in general. It's not a knock on their intelligence by any means, but if you ask them like WH questions about like what, who, where, why certain things happen in that story, they might not be able to answer it, but they can still read it out loud. It's kind of funny about hyperlexia too, and this is just as my previous like very, very mid career in opera, is that when I was going to school for singing, for voice performance, we have to learn the diction. We take diction classes to learn how to pronounce Italian, French, and German and English for singing, okay, for classical singing. And that effectively made me very hyperlexic in certain in those languages. I mean, obviously English I know, but hyperlexic in like French and German and Italian in the sense that, particularly for Italian and German, French is the rules of pronunciation are different in spoken French versus like classical singing. It's a little different, and like poetry reading and stuff, they have a slightly different vibe going on there. So I'm not very good at actual spoken French, but I can read German and Italian, and I might not know what it says. I might not understand the words at all, but I can usually read it off and sound pretty decent, or at least like close to something that a speaker of those languages would actually understand. But it's because I know the rules of pronunciation. It's not because I understand the language fluently or I read it fluently, because I can't always understand what I'm reading. Anyway, so that's just kind of an interesting thing about hyperlexia is you've ever learned how to pronounce a foreign language, but you don't really know all the words, but you can kind of say the words, but you don't know them really. That's kind of what hyperlexia is, essentially. It's just that in kids, particularly for little kids who've developed it, who have hyperlexia, their brain just figured out the patterns on their own. They didn't take a class or anything to learn it. They just are really good like that. It's kind of amazing and really cool, in my opinion. Super cool to see. And then, of course, with this dyslexia stuff, you also have the dyscalculia and the dysgraphia. Dysgraphia is, I mean, it colloquially gets described as messy handwriting, but it's more than that. It tends to be, I think it's more motor based and like as in like you can't make that handwriting any better, and it like doesn't really get more advanced. It might still look like a little kid's handwriting for a long time, that kind of thing. So it's more of a clinical thing. I would assume occupational therapists probably have something to do with diagnosing dysgraphia. Dyscalculia is a disorder. It's like dyslexia, but with math, essentially with numbers, is my understanding. I'm not super educated in that either, because speech language pathology, we don't tend to deal too much with math and numbers all that much. We might deal with like understanding word problems when you read them because of the language piece, but we don't really deal with like the actual manipulation of numbers. Not so much our jam. So those are just things to be to consider, especially if you're a parent of a kid going through school, because dyslexia, dyscalculia, dysgraphia, these are definitely things that hopefully in the United States your school is recognizing. Your school district hopefully would recognize it, and they could get assessed for something like some level of accommodation or an individualized education plan, an IEP, where they can get some additional help with those things, because those things definitely hinder accessing academics and learning in schools. So, like, I personally think, I am pretty sure, and my dad is pretty sure he's dyslexic, but he was never diagnosed because he's like in his 70s now. So like back then people weren't diagnosing dyslexia. I don't even know if it was super well known at that point when he was a kid in like the 1950s or 60s, right? But now that he's an adult, he doesn't read books, you know, like reading is still very hard for him. And so, because he spends so much time trying to like sound out the words in his brain that it's like he can't keep up with what he's actually reading in terms of the meaning, because it just takes too much mental energy. Okay. So, when people get really good at reading, they start recognizing whole words and just reading by sight words. But most people need some type of decoding first. They need to understand how to sound out a word, and then they can start to remember those words. And then they start to read really fluently. And dyslexic people get stuck at the decoding. And then words get longer and sentences get longer, and they're still stuck trying to sound it out. And then it's like there's too many things going on for their brain to remember what they're reading. Like, what is the meaning behind it? Hard to remember when you've spent all that effort just trying to sound out the words constantly. Does that make sense? Hopefully that makes some level of sense. So those are the main EAs I was thinking of. There's other EAs out there. There's so many EAs, you guys. There's so many terms for so many like quirky little things that the human brain sometimes just shows up and is able to do. There's tons, but those are the main ones I was thinking of in terms of things I see discussed in autistic communities online and even in person. So Alexithymia, Synesthesia, Aphantasia, Prosopagnosia, Anosognosia, and the dyslexia, hyperlexia, dyscalculia, dysgraphia. Hyperlexia isn't really a disorder. It's just kind of it's almost like a cool party trick, like a 3-year-old can do. If 3-year-olds have party tricks, hyperlexia is kind of just this cool thing. And they probably would develop into a pretty advanced reader once they are taught comprehension for the stuff they're reading, right? Let us move along to these dominant survival mode things. Survival mode, what I mean by that are situations where you have high fight, flight, freeze activation. So high sympathetic activation, your sympathetic nervous system. When that sucker gets going, so you got all that adrenaline rushing through your blood, you got all that energy, maybe you got the little tunnel vision, okay? When things get tough and when things get stressed, so that is like a form of stress for your system, okay? And for certain, typically these get talked about a lot in the autistic community, but I have seen the ADHD community start to talk about PDA, which I like the term persistent drive for autonomy. That seems a much more accurate term. But the way that it was originally proposed is pathological demand avoidance. Persistent drive for autonomy, this just gets discussed a lot because it does create a lot of behavioral concerns for parents if they have a kid who's starting to show this. I'm starting to suspect I might have a bit of PDA, like upon retrospect, but I just thought, as growing up as a not diagnosed person, and also the fact that it was the 80s, nobody talked about this stuff, I just thought I was really stubborn, okay? So if my mom told me to do a chore, even if I was this close to getting up and doing it, the second someone told me to do it, no, I'm not doing it. You told me to do it, I'm not doing it. Absolutely not. Just refused to do it until I felt like doing it on my own, with my own autonomy, by my own choice, without anybody saying anything. That's what I waited on for my own motivation to do the thing. And I can still get that way as an adult if it's things, like not so much for work situations, that's a little different. But like in home settings, I can get the same way. If it's like, are you ever going to do the dishes? It'll be like, no. Since you said that, no, I will not. If you want me to do them, you shouldn't have said anything. Like it can get really... This is not an actual diagnosis. I want to be very clear. Persistent drive for autonomy is not an actual diagnosis. It is not, I don't believe it's in the DSM-5. It's not in any sort of official anything. It is a profile that people talk about. So it's been given a name and a label, and it does get talked about a lot. And I'm pretty sure there are researchers currently studying it. But it's not an official thing by any means. PDA, or pathological demand avoidance, persistent drive for autonomy, is a developmental profile characterized by an extreme resistance to ordinary demands and expectations driven by an anxiety-based need to retain control and autonomy. Within the autism spectrum, PDA presents a distinct profile where individuals employ socially strategic behaviors such as distraction, negotiation, or even confrontation to avoid perceived demands, differentiating it from typical autistic presentations. The core feature revolves around an over-responsive demand avoidance mechanism rooted in heightened anxiety, necessitating specialized intervention approaches that emphasize anxiety management and flexible collaborative strategies to support engagement. PDA also can include eloping. I do want to be clear. Some people, I don't think it was originally thought of as that, but kids who elope, kids who leave, like they run away from a demand, which can get really scary because they might run into the road or something, and they might get lost if you're in a city and they run away. Like it can be a very scary thing to have a kid who elopes, but it can also be part of that avoidance of, I hear there's a demand, and now my body immediately says no to that demand, and they run away from it. So that can also be in there. So they could be fighting, they could be fleeing, or they could be essentially like freezing up and just refusing to do anything, or they could be like negotiating or something like that, or trying to be kind of like cutely distracting away from it. Particularly for little girls, they tend to do more of like a cute distracting thing because socially that's more acceptable for girls to do. You know what I mean? Because kids are smart. They learn what's socially acceptable. Essentially, it's thought to be kind of an overreactive fight or flee, right? Fight or flight, in the case of elopers, type of mode. So it's almost like the reaction is more than you would expect for a demand being placed. They basically go into a survival mode when a demand is placed. And in people with really severe PDA, it can be really bad. Like even if it's like a, hey, you can pull up a chair if you want to, that could be perceived as a demand, even though you're being polite and nice. And they might be like, no, and they like leave, So it can be really difficult. But I think if it is more based in survival modes and stress response, my guess is something like regulation strategies would probably help to teach someone to kind of navigate their own PDA profile a bit, hopefully. But it is a tricky one because you don't want the teaching to be a demand either, because then that just triggers it more. So it does become a very tricky thing. And a lot of people in a lot of communities, particularly parents, talk about it a great deal. And I believe there was a study, I'll have to look it up. I think I saved a link somewhere where there was a study, or was it a study? Or it might have just been a survey type thing. I'm not sure. But essentially they think that PDA might co-occur with like more ADHD autism profiles, like the AUDHD profiles might have more of the PDA profile than not. And PDA typically shows up a lot in kids who are non-apparent autistic kids. Okay, so they're kids who otherwise they might not even need special education, but because of the PDA, because of the behaviors around it, they might get something like an IEP to help them out with that. So that's just an interesting one, which I could go on and on and on. Actually, it's super fascinating, and there's a few people I could even possibly interview or something for some help explaining it, because there are mental health practitioners who really specialize in PDA. Not as specialized, my understanding, in my field. There's people who definitely know what to do with it and like have learned a lot, but I do think mental health circles seem to be where a lot of people are really trying to specialize in helping families and kids with PDA. So I took a training once. From my understanding, regulation is a really useful thing. The next dominant survival mode thing that I want to talk about. Now, this is it is my hypothesis based on the neuroscience that I understand of things, but it also is one that looks like it kind of dovetailed what people are kind of thinking might actually be the physiological mechanism behind this. And it is what is called selective mutism, which I hate that term because colloquially, it's one of those terms, research-wise, fine, you get to specify what you mean by it, which what they meant by it was it is selective in the terms of in certain situations, in certain environments, the person is unable to speak. That's what it really means. So I like colloquially calling it situational mutism because it's not about a person's voluntary ability to talk. It's about the situation itself, and they might not have access to like turn their voice on and speak in that particular situation. And it's usually thought of as, now for the longest time, nobody knew about it, but situational mutism, I believe, is in the DSM-5 under anxiety disorders, but I think of this as being sort of an overreactive freeze response in a way. So for some reason, physiologically, people who have situational mutism, when they go into some sort of survival mode, if they feel like they're under threat or they're under some sort of high stress or anxiety type of situation, they have reported that it feels like their voice essentially is shut down. It's like cut off. They can't make their voice from their throat and their larynx here. Like they can't make it work, okay? And we do know from converging evidence from animal studies and then also from like lesion studies in humans and certain disorder like studies of voice, like quite frankly with things like spasmodic dysphonia, which is what RFK Jr. has, when people with spasmodic dysphonia speak with or use emotive voicing, so if they like are laughing or yelling because they see a scary spider or something, their voice doesn't have the dysphonia. It doesn't have that weird, that really tight spasmodic kind of profile when they're emotional. And so that is one of those evidences of there is a motor pathway from our anterior cingulate, okay? So they're very likely, because it's in primates, so very likely humans have this. We have a pathway from the neurons in our anterior cingulate when we're feeling certain things that go out to things like our voice and our facial expressions and things like that. And there's also, sometimes it's called the PGA or the perioccipital gray pathway. This pathway comes down and it does go into the voicing of like primates and such that we know of. And humans do have certain conditions that seem to show that we have a similar pathway. And so the thought of currently with situational mutism is that if they go into some sort of survival mode or in that high stress, for some reason, physiologically, their body, that pathway essentially cuts off their ability to speak emotively. So like from the stress, their voice is essentially cut off. Like they can't access it physiologically to make it work. And so that is thought to be sort of the physiological explanation around situational mutism. But it is important to know about because it is one of the things, especially for non-speaking autistics. There are plenty of non-speaking autistics or partially speaking autistics who have situational mutism, and is the main reason why they don't speak with their mouth. And they might learn an alternative way of communicating expressively, either through a high-tech device or maybe a low-tech device, or if they're able to have the motor coordination, they could use sign language, some form of sign language system. depending on what country they're in. In my country, it would be ASL, American Sign Language, but in other countries, other SLs, other sign languages. That kind of brings me into one of the other two bonuses here. Thinking of motor coordination is one of the other things to consider are mobility / physical differences and disabilities there within the neurodivergent community. Now, differences with mobility and physical differences means that if somebody does have these differences, they might be an apparent autistic, they might have an apparent disability if it's mobility based, right? People can see it immediately and go, haha, yeah, that person definitely has difficulty here. But there are more subtle ones also within the neurodivergent community. So one of those would be a more flat affect, facial affect, or flat voicing affect, right? So medically speaking, I think in certain mental health areas, affect is used very differently. But medically speaking, as speech pathologists in the medical side, we are trained to recognize affect, okay? And affect is essentially the outward expression of emotion, or essentially your internal state. It's the outward expression of something, okay? So flat facial affect would be someone who does not have a lot of facial expressions. I tend to be the opposite. I tend to have a lot. I can't do a poker face. Like, what I think is out here for the world to see, unfortunately, sometimes. But people with more flat affects, they might always look basically like this all the time.
Ouch. You ran over my foot. I am in incredible pain.
And so that is a flat affect. Okay, that's a flat facial affect. Somebody who's like, I am feeling something, and you can't see any signs of that on their face. That can be an autistic thing. It can also be other issues. In fact, speaking of mitochondrial things, people who have difficulties with mitochondria, people who have conditions where they do have an issue, it's usually genetic, and it's not something you can necessarily see in people in an airport, RFK Jr., and they're very rare. Mitochondrial conditions, genetic mitochondrial things are pretty rare. So I don't know what he's talking about. I don't think he knows what he's talking about. But that actually can be a condition that comes with flat affect. Flat facial affect can be an aspect of that. But also, like, not a whole lot of body growth through childhood. Also, like, there can be a lot of other things that go along with that because the mitochondria do a lot of things. So, yeah. Okay. Anyway, I'll get myself off that soapbox because I'm not really an expert in mitochondrial disorders, but neither is RFK Jr. And I don't even think he knows what he's talking. I don't think he knows what mitochondria is. I genuinely don't think he knows. I think he just thinks it sounds fancy. Maybe it's a word that he just heard about in some sort of meeting with other doctors who were talking about it, and now he's throwing it around as like this fancy word he knew. I would not be too surprised if that's what he was trying to say. Oh my gosh. But now watch, that is totally going to be like medical grifter terminology now. Like they're going to adopt that and be like, yeah, do this cleanse to get rid of your mitochondrial issues. And it's like, that's not even, I cannot even begin to express how much that is not how this works. That is not how any of this physiology thing works. Okay, I'll get off that high horse though, but seriously, please don't fall for things about that. Our timeline is really weird, guys. This is a weird timeline we're living in that suddenly people are talking about mitochondrial things. Was not on my bingo card that would be a thing. Okay, anyway, other mobility and physical difficulties could be things like apraxia. There is limbapraxia. There's also apraxia of speech. So for some dang reason, the last 12 minutes that I recorded for this video just doesn't exist right now. I don't know what happened to it. It just disappeared into the ether. So apraxia is essentially an issue with motor planning. So in order for us to execute any level of movement, there's like a stepwise order to how we have to do, right? So if I want to like reach and pick up my stuffy, right? I have to like reach over to it, grip it a certain strength level, and then hold, trade it off, let this hand release and bring it to me, right? So that's an order, there's a sequence of events there, right? And with apraxia, that sequence of events gets all jumbled, essentially, okay? It's almost like the wrong formatting. Like if you've ever sent a document to a printer and then it prints out all funky because it just didn't, the paper was wrong or whatever. Kind of like that, where it just kind of got out. The result seems very jumbled, but it essentially comes from the brain, the motor center in the brain, not sending out the right patterns in sequence as they should be done. So there is limb apraxia. There's also apraxia of speech. You could have acquired through like a brain injury, like a stroke or something. You can also have childhood apraxia of speech. If a young kid is non-speaking, and when they try to speak, they're really not very intelligible, like you really can't understand what they're trying to say, or they sound like they're speaking a different language than like what the family knows, then yeah, that might be something to consider, that they might have an issue with the motor planning for speech, because there is a certain sequence and order to how our tongue has to move, our lips, how open our mouth has to be, whether our voice turns on or off at certain times when we talk. And if any of these things get out of sequence, or if the muscle movement is either not there or too big, it can really affect how intelligible we are to everybody. So that's just something to know about in terms of apraxia. There's a lot of other things that can impact both speech and limbs in terms of like, in speech terms, we'd call it like a dysarthria. So things that essentially affect the motor planning, like further down from that primary motor strip in our brain. Anything that affects it further down usually gets a different name. That's essentially how that works medically, because the cause is a little different and the treatment trajectory might be a little different. So if there's other things that can look like apraxia that actually aren't, but you need a trained professional to like look into that for you, Another thing to be aware of is like motor tics, muscle tics, right? Most commonly people know about Tourette's. They might not have a fully great grasp on what Tourette's really is, because it's often used as a punchline and like shows and in entertainment, but it is a disorder in its own right, and it does overlap with other neurodivergencies a fair amount relative to just sort of general population. And there's also, of course, just within the fact that we're all a bunch of humans, there can be so many different varieties of combinations under this other differences and disabilities and things like that. They could have chronic pain, they could have dietary restrictions, autoimmune disease, of course. We're all people. This is all stuff that affects humans. And so neurodivergents are people. Surprise, surprise to RFK Jr. and other folks out there. Autistics and ADHDers and all other neurodivergents. We're also just humans. We're variants of humanity. So yeah, we end up with similar health issues as humans have. So we have the EAs. That was our first big section, right? You have Alexithymia, Synesthesia, Aphantasia, Prosopagnosia. I realized while editing I said that wrong. Prosopagnosia. I'm like putting a P where the S is. My mouth, I don't know. I don't know what it does sometimes. Prosopagnosia, face blindness, and Anosognosia, which is like blindness to your own condition, essentially. You're not quite aware of what you can and can't do, kind of a thing. And then the others, like the dyslexia / hyperlexia, dyscalculia, dysgraphia. So EAs are more prevalent in neurodivergent communities than in others. And one of those on its own is a neurodivergency, but they do come comorbid. They come combined more often with like autistics, ADHDers, and other like genetic syndromes and such. Okay. Then the next little section we talked about were dominant survival mode things. So we talked about persistent drive for autonomy, which is also more like originally called pathological demand avoidance. And we talked about situational mutism, which is more formally mentioned. I believe it is mentioned in the DSM-5 as selective mutism, but it's a branding issue with labeling that in colloquial terms because it is situational. What I propose here is that persistent drive for autonomy is kind of like a heightened fight or flight response, like really heightened and really hypersensitive to going into fight or flight when a perceived choice, like when their brain perceives they don't get a choice in something. And situational mutism is possibly a really heightened freeze response where essentially access to their vocal mechanism and their speech through that is essentially cut off through a really heightened freeze response when they're under a really high stress or anxiety level, okay? And then we talked about these like smattering of other things like delayed sleep phase. So maybe it's not insomnia, maybe it's actually delayed sleep phase, and your inability to fall asleep early is because naturally you just don't. And so your brain just keeps constantly going back to falling asleep later and later, like mine does. And then also the mobility / physical differences and disabilities. So we talked a little bit about flat affect, especially for facial affect, for facial expressions, and voice if you have more of a monotone way of speaking or a really heightened, like really sing-songy way of talking. And then we also talked about other motor things. And the main point for this, if you've got this far in the video, thank you so much for watching. Yay! And I hope you found it helpful. And I'm definitely going to make sure there's chapters in this video so you can click back to whatever section you want to hear a little more on. And I'll put, the names, like the spelling of the words, they should be up on the screen so you can always look it up a little more on your own. But my main point with this video is it also, in that Venn diagram, it crosses over into social in the sense of finding community and connection, because these are considerations for additional accommodations for certain groups who get together, right? Not everybody can get every need met all the time, but the whole point is to try to move toward more of a cooperative status in how we accommodate each other and how forgiving and compassionate we are with each other, versus more of a compliance based, like, well, you have to fit in here or else you're out of here. So synesthesia person, we're all going to meet at the coffee shop. Sorry, you're just SOL. So that's the idea here, is just to broaden our knowledge about what we might encounter in the community in general at large, to help us both find our people that we can be closer to, but also to, like, when we are planning bigger events or community events, or if you have like a community center or some sort of meetup happening, considerations for additional accommodations that might be needed, right? Because you're involving what is already a disability community, but there can be people with more apparent disabilities, more mobility issues, or just heightened sensory needs, or what have you. So like, these are just ways to build hopefully more compassion, more understanding, so we can collaborate and build a little more connection and community with each other. And also, of course, hopefully it helps us all understand ourselves individually, because you might have more overlap here than you would expect. If this helped you, let me know. Drop it in a comment below. If you want me to do a deeper dive on any of these topics, also please let me know. Please drop it in a comment below. Thank you so much for watching once again. I hope you all have as good as you can, at least a week or two. Do things to take care of yourself, look after yourself. Rest and recovery is always a vital part of life, and enjoyment is also a big deal, especially in these really trying times right now. Try to, do the whole Gen Z go touch grass, in the sense of like, do something enjoyable and kind to yourself. And in the interest of building more community and more compassion and understanding of each other, I am reclaiming the word weird for myself. So in that spirit of using weirdness for good in connection and community, I wish for you all to keep it weird. And until next time, everybody, bye.